There's a whole debate about how honest the field of history is that's going on now. This is a discussion I think society should have, but I don't think we frankly have the literacy or the honesty for either our chattering or ruling class to do so now. In that when you're looking at studying the past today, you find that almost all criticisms about how history is written come from a place of ideology, and that they only care about the politically important current events. Our entire culture has been consumed inside the obsession of politics, and practically no one is genuinely looking for the truth now. When they look upon the past, they only see the reflection of the present. As a general rule, in the ancient world, the issue is lack of sources. However, for the last 1,000 years of Western history, we have so much evidence on literally everything, from each perspective, primary sources, tax records, notes, archaeology, wine purchasing levels and the price of grain, and all that kind of thing, that it's basically impossible to hide something big. Once you get outside that time frame to the ancient or non-Western world, sources can get very murky. Anyone who pretends to know what's really going on in prehistory, for example, is a charlatan. However, the real place where people lie is context. Humans have to live our lives as a sort of story with clear direction, which was one of Jordan Peterson's best points in his best book by far, Maps of Meaning. That book is so incredibly good, possibly one of the most important of this century, and I think a lot of people who get turned off by Peterson's career as a pundit don't see that he's incredibly revolutionary and important in his given field, or the intersectionality of psychology, human nature, religion, and neurology. Thus, one story hides as much as it reveals by its own nature. You'll find there are stunning historic lies which occur through the purposeful deceptive use of contextual frames. You're only trained to operate inside your own frame, and thus the public can be legendarily gullible or naive. You can see where people are irrational or using propaganda in which they are incapable of looking at both sides of the coin. All good things have negative elements and vice versa. When someone says something is just unilaterally good without consequence, you know they're selling you something. For example, I loathe communism, but as I analyze communism, I try to explain why I think communism was so popular over history, operating out of the self-interest of communists. This is what I consistently found in reading histories of philosophy or world history, where there's a big shift in how they frame the world that occurs around the start of the 20th century or World War I. I've spoken before about how the world wars brought about a cultural shift on the scale of the foundation of a new religion or civilization, which I call modern civilization, which I made one of my best videos about explaining. Once you hit the 20th century, you'll see historians who otherwise have the toughest minds in handling the past, passing judgment on the great men of history or entire civilizations, suddenly suspend all seriousness. Changes after this point are just unilaterally good, with no read on the costs involved, something that's never happened before in history, according to their own book. In histories of philosophy, you see the jump from reading about complex figures like Plato, Nietzsche, or Spinoza to entries on the philosophy of mathematics or very specific hyper-autistic things completely unrelated to daily life, like whatever Heidegger did. You see histories that practically say that all of our human history was completely wrong, and we just gained enlightenment on our new perfection after the world wars. After thousands of years of people fighting tooth and claw for meaning or glory, psych, everyone's equal now, that was all stupid. They should have just adopted agnostic liberalism, and then the Crusades, Renaissance, empires, and religions were all unnecessary. Maybe if Plato read John Rawls, he'd see why meaning was unnecessary, since we should just give the poor more money. Maybe George Washington would have been smart if he had an iPhone. The point I'm trying to make here is that there was a historic event which occurred at some point in the early 20th century in which the West completely suspended any concept of seriousness or reality around life. Any genuine desire for anything or sense of soul was gone. This is an event that completely dominates every single element and moment of our lives today, but which is never discussed seriously. We are living in illusion about what the greatest shift of our age was. Welcome to what I call the Bluepill era, the age of platitudes as religion, the age of Nietzsche's last man, the veritable age of plastic. When you look back over history, you see certain historians stuck in the worldview of their ideology. People don't have ideas, ideas have people, to pull from the Jungian tradition. The great irony is that the story of the 20th century will be written centuries from now in an almost diametrically opposite narrative than today. We stopped being able to see the world honestly since we became conquered by a new religion, one whose dominant precept was that it was not a religion. The new elite brought about a tyranny greater than the Catholic Church, Rome, or China. The West is now only waking up to its rapid domestication and the death of our soul. I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm not.
The blue pill has removed all traces of masculinity in society, but Black Forest is bringing it back with cocoa flavanols, the compound found in cocoa that boosts nitric oxide, improves heart health, and regenerates brain cells. Before you roll your eyes, this isn't nonsense. Let me show you Harvard scientist Dr. William Lee actually back this up.
Now, how do we know this actually functions, works in people? Well, clinical studies have been done with high flavanol cocoa to show that in men who are in their 60s with heart disease, they could actually just have 2 cups of dark chocolate hot cocoa a day for a month. Yeah. And they doubled the amount of stem cells in their bloodstream, and their circulation improved measurably. And then what's even more important and impressive is that there was a study called the Cosmos study that was completed recently that showed that eating high flavanol cocoa decreases the risk of cardiovascular death.
Flavanols are the good stuff found in cocoa beans, but they're usually destroyed during the chocolate-making process. That's where Black Forest supplements come in. They've created the first ever high flavanol cocoa powder packed with everything your body actually needs, and it's only 20 calories. I mix it with my coffee or my protein shake, where it tastes amazing. This stuff can boost your body's natural stem cell production. Hollywood elites drop $50,000 on placenta stem cell injections, but you can just drink cocoa powder and get the same benefits without selling your soul and wallet for it. And let's be real, as men we must be strong, mentally sharp, and in peak condition to win. No one's going to take care of us but us. Being your own hero starts with physical fitness, lifting weights, building endurance, eating the right foods, and taking the right supplements. I have an exclusive offer with my guy at Black Forest Supplements to hook you up with an amazing 40% off offer for the next 48 hours. But this stuff always sells out, so don't wait. 40% off, 48-hour only promo. Hit the link in the description and pinned comment to stock up before it's gone.
Part 1, the pills. It's kind of funny. I think that in the future, the red pill culture of places like 4chan will end up being written in legitimate cultural or philosophic history books as influential. The reason I say that is that leftism is clearly failing, and the only thing that can really fill the void is rightist philosophy.
Yes, Anon, you can become a historic figure by schizo posting.
The further irony is that the older rightists or boomer cons demonstrate almost zero interest in the intellectual future of the right, agreeing with the left in general values or direction, just wanting a slower speed. Meanwhile, the next generation of right-wing thought is almost entirely based around internet schizos. I'd like to say that 4chan is to the 21st century what black culture was to the 20th, in that most of the youth slang and culture today is originally from 4chan. Examples of words that are from that culture is Sigma, Riz, Beta, Pepe, Grog, Meme Lord, Schizopost, Edgelord, Based, Cringe, Chad, Alpha, Cuck, amongst others. Older folks tend to not understand this, but the red pill was a seminal moment in the development of Gen Z, my age group especially. At this point, it's been nearly completely normalized among men my age, in that even leftist young men at least now faintly know about the red pill, even if they reject it. Funnily enough, the leftist managerial regime trying to suppress Andrew Tate possibly did more to legitimize it than he himself did. To backtrack a little, the red pill is a concept from The Matrix, a theme which I'll tease out more so over the course of this video, in that the fantasy setting The Matrix is set in is predicated upon the idea that there's this false but pleasant reality that people live in order to feel better about a fundamentally exploitive system. In the movies, humanity is being harvested by an evil AI centuries in the future, which forces us to live in the illusion of the late 20th century so that we can look away as it harvests our energy more easily. Certain people are capable of seeing the edges of the matrix where they start to form a resistance. The question offered to those who are on the margins of the matrix blue pill world is, do you take the red pill to learn the unpleasant truth and you can never go back, or do you take the blue pill to continue to live in pleasant ignorance? The reality is that we do live in a sort of matrix today, which is something the authors could probably pick up intuitively, in that much of the purpose of art is to understand complex subconscious truths that can't be articulated in the first logically. Almost everything we believe about reality today is wrong. Just to go through a few, equality is a lie with no evidence for it and lots against it. Genetics determines half of human nature at least. Humans are not naturally good, and we aren't blank slates that can be arranged for any purpose. History isn't over, with liberal social democracy not being the end point of the human condition. God isn't dead. The disenchantment of the world isn't a real thing besides in our neurology. Culture exists and really matters. Men and women aren't the same. Biological race is objectively real. Modern physics has been stalled by the government since the early 70s. A majority of papers in psychology have never been checked for accuracy. The CIA, Soviets, and Europeans all have decades of research on the spirit world and psychics. I apologize if I gave some of you a panic attack by saying all that at once, but you'll probably have to toughen up to survive what's next. To be clear, I am unclear on how much of the peripheral stuff for that is true, but the nature of science is to throw ideas out and test them, not to hide behind convention. I think it's beyond disgusting that we agreed to live in a false reality, and I think it's worse to continue to live the lie than to call it out. This is the great question of the blue pill, which can be used to differentiate its promoters versus detractors. Do they see the person calling out the comfortable illusions as a villain or a hero? One man's freedom fighter is another's terrorist. Is the blue pilled man an upstanding member of society or a thoughtless sheep participating in a death cult? The reason that the red pill was such a huge moment for younger guys is that everything that underlies the blue pill is a form of luxury belief or mate suppression, a theme which I'll talk about at greater length in a future video. The thing is that these luxury beliefs were not that costly in the time of the baby boomers, given the society itself was so wealthy with such high social trust. However, as the average person slid into misery or poverty, a statistically obvious trend I explain in this text wall, which is true in like 20 different ways, the cost of these lies grew greater and greater. In fact, past a certain threshold, I believe the elites maintain these lies as a way of keeping the population artificially weak and easy to control. The lies grew more costly and obnoxious as life got worse in order to disorient the public. As I will explain later in this video, this is even more true than I even state here. When you get younger than the baby boomers, the ruling class of the blue pill world, you see a growing degree of cynicism against the society and its structure itself. Gen X make up half of the business owners in America and are seen as an independent generation. The millennials are nihilistic, cynical, and doubting of everything. Gen Z is basically frothing at the mouth in every single limited cultural output they have. Our ruling class actively campaigns off the destruction of their own society that they're in charge of. It's clear that the lies of our social code are tearing us apart, causing vastly more damage than any benefit they give. We've strangled ourselves on our own platitudes. Gen Z men bear the greatest cost out of any demographic from the lies of our age. I'm frankly shocked any Gen Z men feel the will to even pretend to care about what the system thinks. The thing is, they just haven't had the power or opportunity to buck the system yet, but the second that they get any authority, they'll do so. The irony is that Gen Z is hurt since the left is trying to target the established white elites, but since they're already established, they just end up hurting the young men trying to get going in life. If you're looking at this from a mate suppression perspective, young men are the most evolutionarily fit demographic, and so targeting them keeps established interests in power. Almost every single element of life is affected by the lies of the blue pill. Thus, it goes very much to reason that this demographic has every reason to defect against the ruling ideology. Meanwhile, the older folks have more personal, emotional, and financial ties to the blue pill order. What happened here is that as Gen Z men and younger folks in general tried to get going in a progressively more difficult world, one in which quality of life has collapsed, cost of living has skyrocketing, dating options diminished, screen addiction, mental health careening to hell, and an environment becoming progressively more inhospitable to human life, Gen Z and the young in general are forced to face enormous differences between the public narrative with their lived experience. I think it will turn out in the future that the current control on information that the mainstream media elite has today in the Western world will be equivalent to the Soviet Union before it fell. My friend Balaji likes to say that Marxism is to economics what wokeness is to biology. The thing is that our entire belief structure of wokeness is obviously wrong, which we know on a biological basis, since wokeness violates our core biology on a very profound level. The thing we're most biologically wired towards on a basic human level, so much so that their removal destroys us, are sex and its innate duality, competition, hierarchy, struggle, tribe, child rearing, religion, land, and everything else wokeness tries to remove or change. Wokeness is a shit test by the depersonalized bureaucratic system as a form of loyalty test. If you believe things that you blatantly know are wrong in your blood on a biological level, like that men and women are the same or that good and evil doesn't exist, we will promote you inside the system. Bureaucracies work by mob psychology due to the absence of responsibility or leadership, and thus, as always, mobs enact very low-trust exploitive strategies. Thus, the system is demanding complete loyalty as a sort of power game against the population. For women, the main demographic the regime serves, it has become their husband, and they forsake their own children for it. The blue pill order is fundamentally a boomer regime, in that the blue pill came in roughly around a little bit after World War II, and now it's falling apart as the boomers age out. And the reason that the boomer can't break with the regime is they know all of this subconsciously, since from Saw, or a term I invented for studies in ancient wisdom, humans innately understand hierarchy and power relations on a deep biological basis. The boomer derives enough benefit from the system, and the system has broken all of their other psychological stabilizers, whether religion, masculinity, community, family, ethnicity, amongst others. Thus, they have become completely dependent on the system. This is why the normie doesn't rebel, even though it's so obvious that this is an evil and twisted system, since the system has removed every other psychological stabilizer and destroyed every attempt at independence already. The normie, by rejecting the system, rejects their God.
As Balaji likes to say, the 19th century was a society in which God mediated the social structure. In the 20th century, where the state did, where effectively we worshipped the state as a god. And the 21st century will be one in which the network is the dominant social organizing principle, and that's probably going to be reflected in our concept of God and religion. What we're seeing now is the painful and complex shift from a state-based social structure to a network one.
Meanwhile, for the mostly younger guys, the system offers us literally no reason for cooperation. The system openly spits on us, refusing to offer us literally anything, or even the basics like work, mate, and meaning that all societies look for. Thus, what's happened is that this demographic looks for any other answer to the realization that their entire worldview is a lie, and their society is actively built off hurting them. Only a few are strong enough for these truths, but the rest will gradually have to learn them as people realize how desperate the situation is. The lies of the regime are most obnoxious and obvious in dating. The regime would firstly have us believe that there are no deep divisions at all between men and women, unless women are better at them, which is so obviously a lie, it's insane we ever accepted it. Secondly, that women sexually reward docility and kindness, which women openly say they don't all the time. It's obviously true women are not as disposed as men to leadership or high-intensity positions, or that women aren't purely kind or compassionate creatures, since they constantly engage in high school, socially damaging relational warfare. Literally talking to women will dispel most of the myths of our society, and if you listen to female music, they'll openly talk about all their faults. The thing as well, and I can't overemphasize the importance of this on youth culture, is that women are attracted to power and aggression for its own sake. The reason she likes bad boys is that women are attracted to disturbances more so than goodness. They would rather feel pain than boredom, which is obvious if you hear women's sexual or literary fantasies. When you look at Gen Alpha slang, it's all stuff related to how sex exists at a cross-section of power and dominance, not morality. That includes slang terms like alpha, chad, beta, cuck, sigma, rizzler, amongst others. The obvious endpoint, if this keeps going, and it will, is going to be an amoral society with no clear moral standards and constant violence. This is part of the reason why I think the world is on the verge of a major wars and social collapses, is that the men hate the system and realize that if they tear the system down, women will find them attractive. I can't believe so few others are capable of seeing this. The further endpoint beyond this is that you can't put sex as the dominant organizing principle of your society, since it will always end in this, which is why major world religions created social protections around sex or had engaged marriages picked by the parents. This is a whole different topic that would take an entire other video to explain, but our society is strangely squeamish, terrified, and obsessed with sex in the least productive way possible at the same time. Obviously, the entry point for the red pill, or the realization that the entire society is a lie, for most young men is dating. I can personally relate to this, since this was a journey I went through myself. When I was growing up, I was told if I wanted to be successful with women, I should just be nice. Keep in mind as well that I was born in 2001, so when I was a teenager growing up, the whole Me Too stuff of guys shouldn't ask out girls or glance at them, that was the social mainstream. So for people my age, that was our normal, where we had to go back in time to realize how insane that is. And that advice that they gave, just being kind and nice, that just failed, and it's completely terrible advice. But there wasn't really good advice I could find online as a teenager either. The initial red pill culture was really stupid with stuff like peacocking or dressing in strange fashion on purpose or negging or being mean to women on purpose, both of which work instrumentally in different contexts but are terrible underlying principles to operate on. I didn't actually believe that fully, since it didn't actually seem like these guys genuinely understood female psychology. However, every field starts out kind of stupid and amateur, and much like other breakthroughs, the red pill morphed into an entire culture. The thing that really helped me was dropping out of college, where I moved to Mexico for 6 months with a bunch of frat bros.
The first few years of my adult life were mostly spent with fuckboys, so I have a pretty good idea of who they are and what their people's culture is.
Man, I went to the club like over 50 times in those few years. It was completely not worthwhile, but I'm glad I did it as a way to figure out what I didn't want to do. This is what being young is about. Andrew Tate is symbolic for this, in which he was catapulted to universal popularity and fame, I think in summer of 2022. He's symbolic of a certain cultural phase, which a lot of young men, myself, were included in, that being self-improvement. This is when the red pill went from its organic development online into the young male mainstream. I went through an Andrew Tate phase for about a year, and then I grew out of it. Partly, it's that more stuff came out about his backstory that seemed genuinely suspicious, and also another part is that my fuckboy friends were normally completely dissatisfied with their lives, while the entire goal of that culture is to get laid and rich as much as possible. On top of this, I went through a calculation I think a lot of young men in the self-improvement space went through of, is this actually what I want to do with my free time? Where when I was part of that space, there were lots of people doing things because they thought it would be fun, and I saw very few people actually enjoy themselves. And I think hedonism's overrated unless it's with people you genuinely care about. And I don't understand when people go to the club with complete strangers and then get blackout in an environment that means nothing. Don't do things you think other people want to do. Do things you want to do, because when you add everything up, you'll realize you'll get practically nothing from following the group consensus. They don't care about you. Their group doesn't offer you any benefits. So do the path you want to do. The self-improvement phase was the best thing young guys could do, but by its own nature, these young men self-improved out of self-improvement. That, or they just gave up and fell into nihilism. Most went into the latter direction, while fewer chose to go into deeper things like religion, politics, family, or glory. Frankly, I'm just too white for most of the red pill culture today, and I have no interest in hanging out at Miami clubs. I'd rather try to emulate the great men of Western history instead to attain glory, wisdom, and power. One of the things I consistently find with the red pill is a complete inability to look at the external context of the world, where red pill culture has this attitude,
if you're not rich and you don't constantly get laid and you're not a complete Chad, it's your fault because you're weak.
There's this implicit assumption that if you try hard enough, you can attain whatever you want. And that's not how reality works. Reality feeds you plot lines, many of them are brutal, and you do the best you can in a difficult context. And I wish we'd have more empathy for how much people struggle today, because around us are the lives of millions of Americans living quiet lives of desperation, and we don't care at all. We just kick the poor and downtrodden and tell them to work harder. And I just don't like this culture where the red pill is innately judgmental, and it does so, and the red pill has some positives, but it's got negatives as well, where it judges people for unrealistic understandings of success. There's very little legitimate self-awareness, and what happens when these guys fail, because they're in a fundamentally incredibly difficult era of history in which almost everyone in their demographic will fail, they can't admit powerlessness, and so they're stuck in these cycles of self-loathing, and people are too immature to realize this is an ecosystem-level issue, so they just constantly blame others for not reaching impossible standards of success. In general, young men today are divided between those who put their energies into politics to change the situation, those who try to self-improve their way out of it, and those who fall to nihilism. And what each of these all do is they don't accept powerlessness. This is an innately difficult situation where if they fail, it's not their fault. They all try to avoid the harsh reality that this is not a good situation. I find both camps of the nihilists and the red pill bros distasteful. Firstly, no mature person turns their entire life into sex. Past your 20s, it's just cringe and low class. The guys who are enormous players tend to actually get bored of sex and do other stuff in their life. Also, assessing all masculinity by looking good or money and getting sex is incorrect, since I refuse to define masculinity in terms of what women want. When you let women define masculinity, they do so in their own interests, not yours. Masculinity is the ability to crush your enemies and take what you want. Secondly, nihilism is just boring and lame. I get you people hate life, but can't you not bother me about it? I'm still trying to survive and win here. The nihilists try to tear the whole world down out of envy and resentment. This is why I try to avoid the internet these days, since good books and company are a far better sampling of the human race. So much red pill culture is just completely stupid and artificial stuff, whereas a content creator, I look at creators like Vitalik, and I can see that this is completely artificial and designed. Same thing as Hamza, same thing as a lot of the bigger channels, although there is a lot of really smart red pill, where there's a group of red pill people who are just stunningly intelligent and look at stuff like statistical patterns or evolutionary psychology. My friend Homath has a great channel, but so much of red pill culture is just shaming other men for not being shallow, and it all boils down to a handful of different metrics, whether being jacked, making money, having a lot of hot girls on Instagram, caring about Instagram, and that just simplifies the world to a very stupid level. However, I'm actually really proud of you guys. When this process started, men started by devolving into the most basic hedonism, which is normally the starting process for where the soul moves upwards. But then as self-improvement didn't actually work for a lot of those guys, they didn't find it satisfying. I see a genuine attempt to try to grapple with life itself. I see so many young men who have crossed the Sahara of nihilism towards being able to genuinely search for the worthwhile and meaningful. As of now, enough of us have already crossed the Sahara that we're going to win, because the leftist order will fundamentally not survive and there aren't that many competitors. The thing is that crossing the Sahara is not the only path, and I am not satisfied by the vast majority of the red pill, but I'm very happy at least some have broken out of mouse utopian nihilism. When cultural changes happen, only a small elite normally develops an idea, and after it becomes popular, the general population adopts a simplified version without thought. This is how things are, and it's better to not have a society with too much thinking, which is a damper on action. However, to summarize as of now, the red pill, or those who reject the blue pill, are cast in many directions. Most focus on hedonism, others on hating scapegoats, others on the gym. Most are shallow now, but at least we'll find some ends to this age of nihilism. The age of the boomer is already over, we just haven't realized it yet. I would really like to make a video at the anthropology of the red pill, since I think it's had a profound impact on my age cohort in a big way that's difficult to spot, but will be of historic significance. It reminds me a lot of my extensive research project on the history of the left, in which most modern leftists, or our entire worldview, stemmed from people talking in cafes or having social clubs together, mostly in the 19th century. Then you had all these incomprehensible and silly factions of leftists that remade the world in their image. Almost all the young male right is downstream somehow from the red pill, in that Gen Z men, as well as a very large amount in the older age cohort, came to realize the blank slate was a lie. I would guess predominantly from dating discourse. Whichever theory of human nature predominates in a society will control its social structure on a very profound level. Read the text while here to explain why I think that. It's insane that the social defenders of Western civilization surrendered the idea that human nature was perfectible so easily. We effectively surrendered all of our psychological strategic choke points that we had used to defend our concept of reality for thousands of years to Marxists without a real fight. They surrounded our position and created a false reality that fed into their own self-interest.
We've already spoken about how an entire generation of young men have realized that their moral code is a lie due to how disconnected it is from the reality of modern dating.
Let's explain the great mystery here, how the wealthiest, most technologically advanced, and literate society bought into the greatest mass delusion ever without even realizing it. Part 2, The Rise of the Blue Pill. Over the course of my life, I started out with just wanting to learn, and then over time I came to realize that in my attempt to just be honest, in that I never set out to be an intellectual, I realized that the entire world I inhabited was a lie. Furthermore, a lie that was actively designed to hurt me for no reason of my own. This is something I find completely unforgivable. In our society, we treated young white male children who did nothing wrong worse than America treated the conquered Confederates, Japanese, or Germans after the war. The school system, let alone all the other systems, were completely abusive to young white men when I went to school, engaging in constant ritual humiliation. The West is obviously a conquered civilization in that our conquerors treat the local white populations in a manner identical to other conquered peoples. Before I've compared the oppression my Irish ancestors faced at the hands of English colonialism to that young white men face today. They both experienced discrimination in education, hiring, the court system, oppression of their religion, boxed out of the institutions, experienced humiliation rituals, have their fertility suppressed, and are removed from power over their society. The only major difference was that white people can still vote or own property while the Irish were not allowed to. The question I asked when I was a teenager going through this system is, how did we go from a society where white men were in charge to one where they were ritually humiliated in every major institution? Because that's a very serious question, and it's never really been answered. It's impossible to truly understand the scope of the change that led up to this until you studied it. I talk about this more in my videos on The Greatest Lie Ever Told or Shatter the Glass. However, this is such an enormous topic, I'll probably have to make half a dozen videos to give this topic justice. Suffice it to say, trust me that the entire facade of a reality we pretend to inhabit is made up. None of this is real. For me, I studied about a dozen different topics between history, anthropology, politics, physics, biology, mythology, religion, diet, and others to compare the popular scientific view to the mainstream. We're largely operating out of theories that were disproven decades ago in most cases. What I always found was that the pre-industrial views, which tend to be shared by every society except us, were almost universally accurate when it came to stuff like practical wisdom. We live inside certain mental frames which our culture constructs. Faith is what we believe to be certainly true in our worldview, that which cannot be questioned in said worldview. What our society uses as our ultimate arbiters of faith are equality, socialization, and progress. Whenever we find evidence, we break it to fit into those three's paradigm. What I consistently found every single time was that the mental frame our society inhabits was built by and for Marxists. Marxism may have lost in the Cold War, but it won in the spiritual battles for the minds of the modern world. I have a term I call stupid Marxism. Stupid Marxism is a term for the current ruling ideology of our society. Stupid Marxism is the ability to sell a Starbucks mug with an image of Che Guevara on it. It is bombing Yemen with a drone with a gay flag on it, or the child of a wealthy finance family protesting for socialism. Stupid Marxism is a watering down of Marxism's original emphasis on science or logic, albeit doing those incorrectly and dishonestly to be able to accommodate the two worst elements of female psychology, that being greed and envy. It's a way of tearing others down through mate suppression while living in luxury yourself. It's Hassan, the radical Marxist, with his Gucci bag and mansion. It's the marker of the peak of degeneracy and weakness a society has ever reached in history. I use David Pakman as a symbol for the Democratic Party's thought. I imagine if the gods gave us a man who would be the avatar of the DNC, it would be David Pakman. Thus, when I wonder what the party line for the left is, I just look at David Pakman's opinion on it. I've lived a strange life, and one of the things I keep finding is I meet people where I think, how did creation produce this person? What list of variables made this person the natural outcome? I was trying to figure out how stupid leftism or David Pakman thought makes sense out of the evolution of some intellectual tradition. Wokeness comes from someone culturally and didn't just show up out of the ether. The strange thing is that wokeness is a degenerated form of Marxism, which removed all standards to win in a competition of ideas in a highly feminine, safe, capitalist society. In other words, in a society with no external threats, Marxism was a useful skin suit for the elites to justify their power while appearing virtuous. They then hollowed out any genuine Marxian sentiment to create a completely odious and nihilistic ruling philosophy. People like to call wokeness liberalism, since they pretended to be liberal for the longest time, saying the main thing they cared about was freedom of thought and expression or tolerance. Postmodernism is the easiest example, which claims to posit a worldview without meta-narratives where we're all free to pick our own destiny without oppression. However, postmodernism was never legitimate, as all of the postmodernist thinkers were Marxist. Then, the second postmodernists gained power, they created the most doctrinaire, tyrannical, overtly Marxist worldview possible. The reason I'm talking about stupid Marxism is since my background's in anthropology, I naturally look for what a society's social code is, what its ruling justification is, what its main organizing principles are, its family structure, etc. The problem, though, is that our society is purposely difficult to define because it exists upon a sort of critical deception, and the elite has given up any desire to have a rationally consistent worldview, where across all of Western history, we are basically the only time where the elite says, we are in power because we get to define reality. You can just go away now. We feel no reason to philosophically justify ourselves. That's the intellectual equivalent of what our elite does. And so I've been trying to figure out what our actual sociological moral code is, and I came to stupid Marxism because for every single principle of how our society operates, it stems from Marxist philosophy in a Marxist frame, but then it's watered down and Marxism is turned into a capitalist commodity where the new ruling ideology is this strange combination of a degenerated version of liberal and a degenerate form of Marxist, where it's got the supposed tolerance and social liberation of liberalism, although they've been dropping that lately, as well as Marxism's entire logical structure. And it's difficult to analyze and explain a social code which purposely says it cannot be defined or analyzed because it doesn't care about being consistent.
Let me clarify this briefly, because these are terms that have been purposely obfuscated by the left for over a century so that they can be incomprehensible to any person who's actually trying to understand what's going on, so they don't realize the left's deception. The original meaning of liberal in the American context, where the French have their own variant, is classical liberalism, the ideology of the Founding Fathers that goes back to the 17th century and believes in small government. Meanwhile, socialism stems first from the French Revolution and later from Marxism, where every major leftist group now is intellectually descended from Marxism. And you can see this in that none of their philosophic assessments make sense without a Marxist framework, in that these are ideas that have to have a Marxist root. What happened is that Marxist-derived ideologies, or leftists, started calling themselves liberals in the time period of FDR, so now both terms can be used interchangeably, where I would say that I am a classical liberal, but I'm not the current meaning of the term liberal. All of this complexity is on purpose. Ironically, except for selling out to capitalism, which is a pretty consistent Marxist strategy between China, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, the post-World War I European socialist parties, or the American left, this current ideology is of very clearly Marxist origin. This is since the unconscious assumptions implicit in them can only come from a Marxist framework.
For example, the belief that we're all equal, the progress caused by technological or class change is the only mechanism through which history acts, that progress is effectively a god which demands that the left wins, that there are no real genetic differences between people, that human culture is completely malleable, and that humanity only needs to realize its own innate perfection to reach utopia, that manhood, heroism, change, and struggle will never be needed again. We only needed to be the perfect little last men. Ideas come from somewhere, and these are ideas of very clear Marxist origin. Nietzsche was incredibly prescient, in which, writing around 1880, he predicted the world of the West in the early 21st century would be called the Age of the Last Men. He said that people would only truly understand his teachings after the year 2000. The last men would be a society in which the highest goods would be mediocrity, conformity, and weakness. It would be a society so decadent as to be incapable of defending itself, creating, or procreating. the age of the last men would be consumed by a million petty tyrannies, stupidities, and platitudes. The good thing is that Nietzsche said that the age of the last men would come crashing down with a right-wing cultural revolution caused by a group which he called the Creators. This video partly stems from me trying to figure out how we became the last men. I frequently feel like a stranger in a strange land in which I feel almost no investment in this current society. This doesn't feel like a world I belong in, like we're in some strange timeline where the gods got drunk. I sometimes feel like a Victorian remnant, which makes sense if my parents were old-fashioned enough to name me Rudyard William Lynch. On top of that, coming from a rural area, I see the direction the West is going into with detached horror. When did this stop being a society for people like me? I'm from Pennsylvania, which used to be the core of the old America, and there was a point I realized as a teenager that America as a society was not serving my interests as a Pennsylvanian, that power had gone elsewhere. The blue pill world is an elaborate deception. It's a bait and switch between the public-facing image and the underlying reality. Watch my video on the anthropology of the left if you're interested. This is true on literally every level you could assess for. Firstly, the way the blue pill world worked was by pretending to be the liberal, white, Christian nation that the majority of the West's population consistently wanted when polled. However, the way they structured it is that they say they are the rebels against an oppressive system. There is zero self-awareness about what happens when they get power, since all of leftism boils down to abdicating responsibility. The old Christian WASP patriarchal America is dead. Acting as if it's still dominant is insanely out of date, but that's what the left says they believe. Due to this mirage, the blue pill world is permanently stuck in the post-World War II era. Acknowledging any change over time would demand a change in strategy and ruling ideology, which the ruling class can't stand at all, since they're so bad at governing that any other right to rule would kick them out of power. This is why they're holding on so tight with all the institutions and social shaming possible. This is why they're so dismissive about talking about any of the other issues that plague society today, whether screen addiction, mental health, cost of living, inflation, the economy, the mating crisis, nihilism, or a dozen other things. I'm still in complete shock the society and the mainstream doesn't talk about any of these issues seriously. Our ruling class really got stuck on the myth of the end of history, which was always seen as completely ridiculous by anyone with a brain. Somehow, it was the most popular theory for decades after the end of the Cold War. Our ruling class does genuinely believe that with the end of the Cold War, history is basically over, that religion, war, political shifts, and strife have come to a permanent end due to the perfection of agnostic social democracy. This is from the best-selling book, The End of History and the Last Men by Francis Fukuyama. The thing is that this is a completely insane intellectual line to hold, which makes the current elite completely irresponsible at dealing with the actual horrific reality of the situation today. I've read Fukuyama before, and he's a pretty smart author, but even if his initial argument made sense, it was not taken that way by the leftist elite. The reason that David Pakman, Joe Biden, or a stupid 21-year-old girl types, who are clearly not Marxists, are espounding a worldview that is very definitively Marxist designed is this. What happened is that in a very brief period, I would say due to the removal of clear standards, we saw a very rapid intellectual breakdown of our society's ability to think or function. This came into full effect in the 1960s onwards. The Marxists were able to seize control of our collective intellectual switchboard around the time of the World Wars due to the massive states those wars demanded. The cultural shifts from this centralization with the World Wars occurred a generation later in the 60s and 70s. I say this a lot, but it's easy to forget that in 1950s Britain, they had a 95% top tax rate, and America had a 90% top tax rate at the same time. Marxists are very good at acting covertly, with entire structures and languages on how they do it. I probably need to make a video just on how the Marxists took over society, but in the esoteric mystic tradition, they use certain key words as a way of signaling what in-group they're in. Marxism has no ideological aversion to lying, and so Marxists have a highly developed grammar of deception. In the Marxist worldview, if you seize power for the proletariat, everything you do is moral by definition. Once you take any of their principles, which often start with completely banal or obvious things, like children shouldn't die or people shouldn't be poor, from there they seduce their audiences to insanity through salami slicing. Marxists are very open about how they wanted to take over the West and how they would do it. Just read authors like Yuri Bezmenov, Saul Alinsky, Gramsci, amongst others, and they'll openly say the goal of Marxist cultural penetration was to destroy Western culture in order to disorient the public, to make them more open to Marxism. Marxists called the people who fall for this useful idiots, and Yuri Bezmenov, a former KGB agent who worked on all of this stuff, said that the purpose was to destroy any sense of reality between the seduced and the world. The Marxists called it disorientation campaigns on purpose. He said that you could take a brainwashed person to the gulag and they wouldn't believe their own eyes. The thing is that a world in which the Marxists would win looks a lot like the world we live in fact, identically so. Yuri Bezmenov already said in the 80s that the Marxists had already taken over America's institutions and would start to take over overt power within a generation, which would be around 2008 or when wokeness gained complete institutional capture. The best book on this topic is Leviathan and Its Enemies by Sam Francis. It's a book about how the managerial class took over America over the course of the 20th century, remaking it nearly completely as a society in its own image. The general trend was that around the world wars, a soft sort of leftism gained power in the institutions, which is why the Western press covered up Stalin or Mao's atrocities. The left used the university system to indoctrinate and organize their followers. Then they were able to seize control of the institutions, whether the media, government, law, academia, the school system, religion, or anything else, to covertly manipulate the culture towards Marxist aims or indoctrinate the public. They have to operate through psychological manipulation since they don't actually have physical force, since the military, police, and gun owners are right-leaning. The left, according to Sam Francis, was split between the alliance of the New Left, who are the insane, reality does not exist, let's destroy industrial civilization for the climate crew, and then the consensus liberals, who are the bureaucracy, corporate, David Pakman, WEF types. These two appear to be at odds, in which the New Left scares the public into reasonable concessions for progress, which the consensus liberals play with. However, in reality, they're actually working together, in which the consensus liberals operate under a complex patronage system to pay for the New Left's insanity. As one of my friends in politics likes to say, there's about 10,000 people paid to be Republicans across the country and millions of people paid to be Democrats. This is a major key to the left's power, which people can obviously see, with USAID giving enormous sums of taxpayer money to completely silly leftist causes. The reason that this madness was able to gain control of society is threefold. The first is the one I frequently talk about, that societies that are wealthy are societies that are weak. The wealthiest society ever rationalized the greatest weakness ever, with Mouse Utopia being the horrific endpoint of that. That's within the bounds of human nature. The second point I've spoken about before in previous videos about this is that the managerial class gained power over the West. Leftism has been the perfect ruling ideology for the bureaucracy or managerial class. That since leftism effectively deifies the bureaucracy and government, turning it into a god capable of remaking reality, which is completely insane. The constant progress in distrust for the past or convention destroys any brakes on the constant growth or exploitation by the bureaucracy. The third reason is that in a toxic feminized society, and we are, the government must take on the character of a bad boy, which is what the left is. The left constantly lies to you, gaslights you, makes terrible decisions, is actually a sociopath, enables your worst traits, tells you to get abortions, never lets you be responsible or settle down, and encourages you to be immature. Much like a seduction, the left lied to us while The public got off on the lying up to a certain point too. The shift that occurred within living memory, or the complete leftist insanity that came out first after the 2008 financial crisis, then with Trump or COVID, was a trend that had been building up for a while. When trends occur quickly and massively, it's been building up to a tipping point. What then occurred was that with the external threats of the internet as well as Trump or life getting harder, resulted in the public questioning the managerial regime. The ruling class decided to double down, pulling on their most insane elements in order to maintain their power. The left was close enough to complete domination that they felt if they made a mad dash, they could totally subjugate the West. The problem is they overestimated their own power and authority, while in the process creating the reaction that would destroy them. As times got tougher, the left decided to destroy the entire society, pillaging it rather than keeping it going, to kill the society before the society realized it had been tricked. This is why they keep the public humiliated, focusing on ridiculous things, and they control thought or speech. It's since the slightest degree of space would make the public realize they've been tricked, provoking rage that would destroy the already weak ruling class. Part 3. The Fall of the Blue Pill. It's interesting to see the power of the blue pill world grow at the exact same time it also grew weaker. This is due to the mechanism we discussed before, in which the left had been gradually increasing their level of power through salami slicing. Then, upon seeing the potential threat that could weaken them, they decided to completely change the way they played their cards. Instead of underplaying their power, they instead chose to overplay it, trying to gain complete dominance over every living thought and moment of the people in their society. The thing, though, is that great empires are in the most danger when overextended, often having a tendency to collapse completely with the slightest rumble. This is why so many people have the notion that the last 20 years of leftism have been so insane, but the period before it was sane. It's since the setting we existed in beforehand, or the post-war boomer dream of reality being fundamentally changed from the rest of history, had always been fundamentally Marxist, but not in a way that people could easily perceive. Mobs confuse images with reality, and since there weren't Marxist signs everywhere, people didn't realize that they had been tricked into giving away everything already. Then, the left, who had spent decades building up their force, spent it all in the course of about 15 years. The left now seems worn out, without any vigor, energy, or life inside them. They are the spoiled aristocracy of a dying empire. I have spoken to older conservatives who are shocked when I say that the leftist youth are innately too weak to do anything real. I have given countless examples in other videos how completely pathetic the young leftists are, but due to their great victory with any absence of standards, the current left is too soft to stand upright, let alone fight. Nietzsche said that the age of the last men could be destroyed by 100 men of fiber, since that age would promote such weakness that the system would be incapable of defending itself. Of course, I do not promote violence, but all I'm saying is this current leftist order is a mirage. Once we realize that, it goes away. It's an illusion spun by our own weakness and silliness. Other eras of history didn't have these issues, since they were wiser or tougher than us. First world problems still are problems, but they go away when you stop being a first world country too. I have a tendency towards believing, and perhaps this is just wishful thinking, that the blue pill order will die faster than most people think. I think the best parallel between our current social order is the Soviet Union before its fall. Both are Marxist societies in which, due to the control of the society and avenues of communication, the elites were able to keep the public humming along on an openly failed philosophic concept. It's funny that people frequently talk about how almost no one in the Soviet Union really believed in Marxism from the 1970s onwards, and no one admitted it. This is an element I see in the media all the time today, that we have all of these private concepts about how the world works that we use to survive. However, that almost no one, even conservative media, says the obvious things. I have no idea how you'd survive modern dating if you thought men and women were the same, how you'd survive if you thought the economy was good, or that everyone is equal. It's not that our society genuinely believes these things, since if you watch others' actions, they act differently from that. What we did as a society is create a mask of an inability to discuss obvious things so as to make deception and low-trust behavior easier. This is a constant pattern in female relational warfare, which my friend Homath talks about, and is why women all call themselves 10, being unable to acknowledge that some women are obviously more beautiful than others. However, if you look at women's actions, they clearly know that some women are more attractive than others and do a lot of strategizing and relational warfare about this. Our society is so feminized, it takes on a lot of these tactics. And Joyce Benneson is a great book on female psychology where she says that the female social structure is built on pretending to have equality and then actually doing status games behind the mask of equality, and she's the biggest academic researcher on this topic. No one thought the Soviet Union would fall at the time, with most analysts thinking it would survive into the 21st century. However, after the USSR collapsed, historians looked back in wonder at how it survived so long. In each case, the collective illusion of the society kept said culture going longer than anyone really wanted it to. In both the USSR and America today, the population has been propagandized and educated to not really know how other societies in history or the world worked. In earlier years of Western history, people would compare the ruling regime with all the others of the European tradition, but we're incapable of doing this as a society today because we lack historical literacy. Thus, we default back onto the regime's ideas out of lack of imagination. I don't think it's a coincidence that the schools are so bad at teaching real information, because real information would show how the current order is failing. This is why the ruling regime tries to strangle genuine art, since if we were allowed to dream at all, we'd dream about how much we hated the regime. The thing is, I don't think this regime can last much longer, at least in America. History in some cases is nearly a physics equation, where certain historic trends create levels of pressure which can push back on other forces of pressure. The will of the Frankish Christians held against the all-consuming supernova that was the Prophet Muhammad's legacy in 8th century France. There is no force holding the regime up. No one will die for them. They are parasites. They don't offer spiritual salvation, a reason they're in charge, or any love. It's just social approval. Once that ends, so will the age of the last men. The public is completely terrified to think for itself. When it gets the slightest level of breathing room, it will realize how it's been tricked and spiral into rage. The left doesn't even believe any of these things anymore. If you read modern academics in almost any field that test things in the real world, they'll agree that the leftist narrative is wrong. My worry is that when our society is allowed to breathe, it will devolve into horrific emotions, losing any sense of self or self-preservation as we make terrible decisions. I worry that the weaning off from modernity will feel like an opiate withdrawal to the people experiencing it psychologically. That since modernity is a form of opium, or copium, some may say, which constantly keeps us jacked up on sensations while avoiding anything real in life. We're completely addicted to these phones, and it wouldn't surprise me if the attempt to break phone addiction will look like a legitimate psychological addictive withdrawal. We have to break the addictions of modernity in order to leave the age of the blue pill. The addiction to phones, comfort, lies, physical or intellectual weakness. We're too stupid or weak to do literally anything as a population now. That will have to change in order for us to survive. We will survive, since that's the best option. When faced with death, most men balk. We're so sick of our own ass as a society, it will probably take a lot of pain for us to loosen up. The great thing about opiate withdrawal is it ends. Don't take it too seriously. Just on a worldview, philosophic, religious basis, leaving the blue pill era will be really hard. I don't think people will leave the blue pill in the exact same way. Some will fall into nihilism, cults, hedonism, or rise to heroism. Some will return to religion or community. I don't know, man. I just know we are going to break out of the blue pill order. When all is said and done, we will look out on it as one of the most beautiful experiences of our lives. When we stopped living in fear and lies in order to inhabit reality as it truly is. The pain is temporary, but the ability to truly live will happen for the rest of our lives. To break out of being an NPC to try to become a main character. Sounds like fun. Peace.
Moral code is a lie due to how disconnected it is from the reality of modern dating.